Warning, the following program talks about the actions of serial killers. Some of the evidence of their crimes is shown that some viewers may find graphic or disturbing.
Right now, there's a search for answers about what happened here back in 1976. More importantly, what happened to her. And those possible answers now include one of America's most frightening and notorious serial killers. What has the Osage County Sheriff's Office found when it comes to BTK killer Dennis Rader's past? Was the serial killer even in Oklahoma?
I believe it 100% right now. He's my suspect.
BTK's own daughter is also part of the investigation. She came face to face with her father for the first time in years to ask, "Have you killed more women? Is one from Oklahoma?" She is only talking with Fox 23.
I think we're uncovering things that they just missed early.
And learn what BTK exclusively wrote to Fox 23 about this new investigation. But the district attorney wonders, is this all just part of a political stunt? And if BTK isn't the killer, who is the person who did it?
If Mr. Rader is a first possibility, there is a second possibility that actually, in my mind, probably makes a little more sense.
It's all right now as Fox 23 investigates BTK in OK.
We want to welcome you to Fox 23 Investigates BTK in OK. I'm Sarah Whaley.
And I'm Shay Rozzi. In this special 30-minute report, we're asking the question, did the infamous BTK serial killer have a victim right here in Oklahoma?
I traveled to the former home of BTK with the Osage County Sheriff and in an exclusive interview talked with the man who lost his family to BTK.
A search to find answers in the 1976 cold case of Pawhuska teen Cynthia Kinney. Osage County Sheriff Eddie Verdon says he's working 16-hour days filled with tracking down leads, following up on tips, and doing countless interviews. One of the most recent was a trip to Kansas to talk with a man who suffered greatly at the hands of BTK.
When I saw my mother for the first time, when I saw her laying on that bed, it felt like my heart was ripped out of my chest physically.
It was 1974. Charlie Otero was only 15 years old at the time. He lived in Park City, Kansas, and came home after school to find his parents and two younger siblings murdered.
Oh, we were like in shock.
I went along when Sheriff Verdon went to talk with Otero. Otero told me he reached out to Verdon when learning about the investigation into Dennis Rader's possible ties to Oklahoma. Verdon says BTK is his prime suspect in the Kinney case as of now. Sheriff Verdon then took me to Rader's old property in Park City to show me where he says they recently recovered evidence buried in what used to be BTK's backyard under a shed. One piece of evidence found, women's pantyhose. Verdon showed us those for the first time back in August.
You told us about the pantyhose, but you did find other items that you haven't talked about?
Oh, yes, yes. We won't release those items at this time, but we found several other items.
Sheriff Verdon says he was able to get a search warrant for that property due to other evidence he tracked down.
We had found a letter that said he had buried stuff here that the police had never found, trophies.
Sheriff Verdon says the letter they found proves that BTK's writings are accurate and true, regardless of what Rader is saying now and denying new accusations that he has more victims.
Would you say, based on your evidence, that he's lying?
Well, I definitely know he's not being truthful. You know, we can prove that over and over again.
In September, Sheriff Verdon showed me several bondage photos that Rader took and pictures that he drew. Verdon also showed me some of Rader's other writings. One of the entries was called Bad Wash Day, in which Rader wrote about the fantasy of finding a victim at a laundromat. The sheriff says that lines up with Kinney's case as she was last seen at a laundromat. Rader worked for the security company ADT at the time of Kinney's disappearance. It's been said he was installing a security system at the bank across the street from where Kinney was last seen, but so far there is no physical proof of that. That wasn't the end of Rader's known time in the Sooner State, though. He also worked as a government official for the U.S. Census in 1989, which also brought him here. Verdon showed me a different journal entry that he says shows Rader, in his own words, writing about a victim he had here in Oklahoma at that time.
Like this is in his notebook where he's got the census 89. He's got some kind of a code. And then he's got Oklahoma, B&D, that stands for bondage pick, done at kidnapping. So again, you know, he told you that he never did anything in Oklahoma, and that's his notebook.
And Sheriff Verdon says this specific notebook was written before Rader was arrested. So Verdon believes it's genuine, as Rader never thought anyone would see the writing. Verdon, who's now interviewed Rader multiple times in prison, says it's information like this that keeps him searching for answers.
Only Dennis knows what he did. All we're saying is the writings, the things that he said, leads us to believe he knows a lot more than he's telling.
And Otero agrees.
I never believed that he had just stopped when he said he did in his killings.
We want to give you some background on the BTK killer.
His real name is Dennis Rader, and he's currently serving a life sentence in a Kansas prison.
BTK is an acronym. It stands for Bind, Torture, Kill, which sadly is how Rader murdered his 10 confirmed victims. BTK started killing in the 1970s, but wasn't caught until 2005.
I talked with a serial killer expert to get a look inside the mind of BTK. Video from a 2005 news story captures the stunned congregation at Christ Lutheran in the Wichita area over the arrest of Dennis Rader, president of their church council, identified as the notorious BTK serial killer. He had just attended Lent services 2 days before his arrest.
He brought spaghetti sauce and a salad, and he said, "Here, this is for the congregation." To go from Wednesday to Friday, and to have that conversation with him on Wednesday night, it's 48 hours of just disbelief.
Also in disbelief at that moment, a man who Rader passed the collection plate with. He told reporters Rader spent lots of time with him and his children.
He said, "Daddy, he tricked us, didn't he?"
So how does someone be, a father 1 hour, church-going man the next, to a serial killer the next?
Well, psychology has a term for that, compartmentalization, but Rader's term is cubing.
Dr. Catherine Ramsland wrote the book, Confession of a Serial Killer, The Untold Story of Dennis Rader, the BTK Killer, which is also an A&E documentary.
He has multiple sides, and they're all part of him, but there's only one face out at any given time, so he can pivot to different faces depending on the circumstances, but he can be a good father. He can be the president of a church council. He can be a serial killer depending on where he is and who is looking at the face.
Dr. Ramsland has spent years communicating with Rader through monitors and letters while he sits in the El Dorado Maximum Security Prison in Kansas, serving 10 life sentences for 10 murders. The DeSales University professor says unlike other serial killers who have a troubled past or may have been abused, Dennis Rader had no history of being abused, that he and his brothers grew up in a good family with their grandparents and parents still married. Instead, she says it goes back to a childhood game.
He talked about when he was a kid, he would play cowboys and Indians, and sometimes that involved getting bound. And once he was bound inside a silo, and it was scary, but also kind of exciting.
She says reading true crime magazines and seeing helpless female victims fueled Rader's fantasies and led him to create a hit kit.
For Rader, it was bindings, gloves. He sometimes would have a gun, maybe 2 guns, a knife. It evolved because at one point he learned to cut window glass. So now we have a glass cutter added to the kit.
And losing his job set him off.
He was married by this time, being supported by his wife. That was humiliating for him as a Midwestern guy raised to be the head of the family. It was humiliating, and the anger and the, need to reassert his sense of power came together in a way that, unfortunately victimized other people.
Do you ever get concerned that getting this word out there could lead to copycats?
Sure. but it's out there in so many forms.
She says her focus is on education, intervention, and prevention, so no other life is lost and no other community is left in disbelief. Now, before police caught BTK in 2005, the killer lived a seemingly normal life, as you heard. He even had a family with a wife and children.
I actually sat down for an exclusive interview with Carrie Rawson, the daughter of Dennis Rader. She told me what it was like realizing her own father was BTK. Do you ever wake up and just go, is this real? Is this my life?
Yeah, I was just telling him yesterday, it's been 18 years since Dad was arrested, and I'll still occasionally be like, oh my God, Dad is BTK.
From picnics and hiking to fishing, camping, and church, Carrie Rawson says as a child she remembers her dad, at least on the surface, appearing to be a real family man.
Like, we always worked together, and like we went to like K-State football games, and we just looked very normal and average on the outside.
Rawson's childhood home used to sit on this property in Park City, Kansas. She says while her young self didn't realize the magnitude of the problem, she did pick up on some signs that maybe her family wasn't as perfect as they were perceived.
Mom was like gaslit and love bombed. It was like this cycle where he would like be hard, and then he would take her out to a movie and take her to dinner. You know, and so in that way he almost seemed like this really amazing husband, but he was overly compensating here because of this.
This meaning he was overcompensating for the terror he was inflicting on complete strangers. Rawson says she remembers experiencing verbal and emotional abuse. As for physical abuse,
my brother was physically abused twice. My dad tried to strangle him twice in front of us when he was a young adult.
Rawson didn't talk about any physical abuse towards her that she could remember, but she did mention a horrifying discovery made by the Osage County Sheriff's Office over the summer while they were going through Rader's project notes, as he called them. The notes depict details of what he did or thought about doing to his victims, and she was in the notes. She called the abuse against her, at least as it was described in the notes, worse than what happened to her brother.
I'm just not ready to talk about it beyond that right now.
And while Rawson may not physically remember the abuse, inside she says her young self always knew that something just wasn't right.
I was waking up screaming with night terrors since I was little, and I still have them. I was trying to tell my mom there's a bad man in my house.
Coming up,
he could have been down here with ADT when Cynthia Kinney went missing, 76. But he's denying that.
Why BTK's daughter says it is possible her father had a victim in Oklahoma.
And if BTK didn't do it, who did?
If Mr. Rader is a first possibility, there is a second possibility.
Plus, what does BTK himself think of the investigation? FOX23 sent a letter to his prison cell, and the killer wrote back. Learn what he revealed to FOX23.
FOX23 Investigates BTK and OK continues right now. The Osage County Sheriff has formed a national task force full of what he says is law enforcement experts to help with his investigation.
In part 2 of my exclusive interview with Dennis Rader's daughter, she told me why she joined the task force and the reason a victim in Oklahoma is certainly possible.
Carrie Rawson says her father loved to spend time in northeastern Oklahoma.
He took me to lakes, and we went camping and fishing. We did a whole spring break when I was college down here at Tent Killer. And we were down in Tulsa, like with my mom. Like we would go to the mall and we would stay a couple days and like go to movies and like do stuff she liked.
But none of that started until the 90s. Rawson says there was a period of time in her childhood where she remembers her father refusing to go to or even stop in Oklahoma. Looking back, it's enough to make her suspicious.
I don't know, was he trying to had he done something illegal in the 70s and he didn't want to get pulled over or identified or something?
Rawson says her dad traveled to Oklahoma when he worked for a security company and later as a government official.
He could have been down here with ADT when Cynthia Kinney went missing,
76.
But he's denying that. And then he was back down in here. So he was actually here with the census. So he was here with the census off and on with regionals work between like 88 and 90.
So she says having victims in Oklahoma is certainly a possibility, and she's now working with Osage County Sheriff Eddie Verdon to try and find answers.
Rawson tells me she believes in this investigation so much that she actually had the Kansas governor lift a do not contact order so that she could come visit her dad in prison.
That was in June.
Literally, I was almost having a panic attack before I went in. Like, I had to make a decision of like, I can go in mad, I can go in angry, I can go in sad, I can go in confused, I can go in hurt, right? I can go in all the feelings I've had for 18 years churning. Or I can just set that all aside and go in as an investigator.
She chose the latter.
I don't even think I mentioned the word murder. I was just like, so when you were over here doing BTK, that's how I said it, like buying, torturing, and killing, what else were you doing?
She didn't detail what they discussed or the answers he gave, but she did tell me it was not the last visit she's made. As for Cynthia Kinney's case, I asked her point blank.
Do you think that he could be the person responsible for Kinney's disappearance and murder?
That's a hard call. It's so old and cold.
No matter what, though, she says the work Sheriff Verdon and his task force are doing is important.
We need to get these solved. You know, we need to find these women and get this solved.
I looked up statistics on the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System. It shows that 37 women, you can see them here, disappeared in Green Country between the years of 1974 and 2005, which was the year Rader was arrested. These women were never found.
It doesn't matter who kidnapped these people or killed them, we still need answers. So they're still missing no matter what, or they're still unsolved. And so, like, a really great thing that's coming out of all this madness is that we're getting spotlight on these missing women. Because if it's not my father, why do we have so many of these, and why are they matching up in time? Like, are we legit missing several serial killers? Like, I'm not trying to make a light of it. I'm saying, are we missing several serial killers that were in Kansas, Oklahoma, and Missouri, or is it my father and we just missed it?
After everything we've shown you, you may be wondering, what does the BTK killer himself think about the investigation? Well, you're about to find out.
Fox 23's Rick Marinon sent a letter to BTK's prison cell, and the killer wrote him back.
These words were written by hands that have killed, and those hands belong to this man, Dennis Rader, the infamous BTK serial killer.
I believe it 100% right now. He's my suspect.
After Rader was named the prime suspect in the 1976 disappearance of Cynthia or Cindy Dawn Kinney in August, I wrote Rader asking him if law enforcement was actually onto something. A month later, not only did Rader answer my questions, he revealed far more about what all has been going on this year. Hello, Rick. I hope the informal is okay, he began. He tells me he wrote me back after a recent September meeting with Osage County Sheriff Eddie Verdon, who has been visiting him often and questioning him about evidence. Sometimes these meetings have been hours long and very personal. Rader writes, I like him as a person, but question his pursuit of me. Like I stated, where's the beef? He has a job to do, part of being a sheriff. BTK repeatedly says in response to Verdon, where's the beef? Implying there's no meat to any of his claims. He says it over and over again, claiming it's a nice story and idea, but there's really nothing to it. Rader tells me so far he feels he's being tied to the Osage County case merely by coincidence. In a handwritten timeline, Rader tells me Verdon has shown him evidence many times, either physically or on a tablet, as to what was found and how it may tie in with the Kinney case. Rader says he thinks there's nothing solid. He repeatedly says between how the evidence is handled to create a story and how he sees Verdon, he calls him Sheriff Cowboy and Cowboy Stir-Fry, mixing in ingredients to try to get something presentable to the public in the courts. But what about all the evidence presented over the summer? Some of it shown right here on Fox 23. I sent him photos of the dig at the site of his former Park City, Kansas home, as well as the pantyhose we were told was found in the ground. Rader says he autographed a copy of this photo and gave it to Verdon and called the fabric shown to me by Verdon, quote, infamous garden pantyhose. He has a tablet and a TV, and he watches the news from his cell. Rader saw the same pantyhose that we showed you on Fox 23 in August when it aired on Wichita TV News there at the same time. He says he used that pantyhose in his garden, and what we're looking at was not used on anything except bushes, plants, and shrubs. He also notes, quote, "I did not have those types of trophies." I even asked him about the piece of his journal described as Bad Wash Day, where Verdon says BTK's own writings lay out how he would fantasize about stalking, abducting, and kidnapping a girl from a laundromat, similar to what happened to Kinney. Rader said he didn't recall writing something like that, but said it sounded like another coincidence, or as he referred to it as a straw by the cowboy. While on the run and even in the early moments he was in custody, BTK bragged about his killings. When it comes to keeping some of them secret and there being more victims, he writes about the possibility of a plea deal to provide answers of some kind. Quote, "Tell all is probably sort of a deal in a way. I can tell more as long as I don't try to cover something up, only there is no others beyond the Wichita 10. I can't help bring closure to those cases or really help." And in one major section of my letter, I said, quote, "To bluntly ask, did you ever kill anyone outside of the state of Kansas, particularly in Oklahoma?" BTK replied, "Hell no." In his 2-page handwritten timeline that he sent to me, BTK says he likes Verdon. He'll continue to meet with him. He likes him personally, but he can provide no real new fruit to this investigation. He did say in one specific section, when BTK's own daughter started to get involved, BTK tells me he feels like it, quote, "crossed a line."
Well, there are some who believe the investigation into BTK is nothing more than a political stunt.
Fox 23 heard from the Osage County District Attorney, who says the sheriff is wasting time and messing up a big case. Once again, here's Fox 23's Rick Marinon.
It was just like an Old West showdown, but instead of outlaws face to face, it was two of Osage County's top law enforcement officers.
What he has done yesterday has messed so much up in this investigation, he has no idea what he did.
At issue, District Attorney Mike Fisher's news conference that BTK killer Dennis Rader was not a person of interest in the Kinney case.
As of this date, the information that has been shared is insufficient to file criminal charges against Dennis Rader.
Sheriff Eddie Verdon says that statement was to intentionally mess up his investigation, and he says BTK feels exonerated.
He informed me that he had been basically watching the news, which he does quite often, and had learned from my district attorney that there was nothing. It was not credible.
Fisher endorsed Verdon's opponent in next year's race for sheriff, but Fisher wouldn't respond when asked if he felt BTK was being used to give Verdon free TV time on the news. Instead, he says he's concerned deals to avoid prosecution were being made without him, and he was going to be handed a case that he says cannot be proven beyond a reasonable doubt.
There are certain ways to investigate a case, and I'm concerned that those proper investigative techniques have not been used.
After Fisher's announcement, the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation began their own look at BTK and Kinney. Verdon says he's been looking into the case long before he was elected sheriff. He says at no point did he ever say he was ready to arrest Rader. But the fighting isn't new.
If this is not resolved, I don't want to be sheriff. I'm not going to be in an environment where I have the good guys fighting the good guys and spending our time playing childish games.
When Fisher first took office, Verdon says his team arrested 3 murder suspects in other cases. Fisher says he dropped those charges because the evidence was not good enough to prosecute someone beyond a reasonable doubt. It was a sour first chapter that's now lingered into the present.
I didn't bring them in to embarrass the sheriff. I brought them in because I'm trying to get some closure for these people, and that's the only way I know how to do it, is to bring the OSPI in.
Verdon is suing Fisher for defamation and interfering with the BTK investigation. Both men agree their agencies should be working together, but their relationship is now at an all-time low.
With all the back and forth, Rick has also been investigating the question, if BTK didn't do it, who did?
The other man investigated in Cynthia Kinney's case was Henry Lee Lucas, also known as the Confession Killer. Rick learned more about Lucas.
For years, law enforcement believed Cynthia Kinney's disappearance was linked to a serial killer. Osage County DA Mike Fisher didn't say anyone's name at his news conference, but said law enforcement has always been aware of another suspect.
If Mr. Rader is a first possibility, there is a second possibility that actually, in my mind, probably makes a little more sense.
Fisher went on to say that suspect is now dead. For the first time, Fox 23 can report from law enforcement sources that this man, Henry Lee Lucas, known as the Confession Killer, has been the suspect in the Kinney case. Lucas was known as the Confession Killer because he admitted to dozens of murders, even ones he didn't do. Starting in 1951 with a Virginia girl who wouldn't have sex with him, Lucas then went on to kill his mother in 1959. He served 10 years in prison and underwent electroshock therapy, but was ultimately released because of overcrowding. He then went back to killing, but Lucas wasn't alone this time. He was friends with Otis Toole. Together, they bragged about killing 108 people individually and together in several states. The most famous being the disappearance of Adam Walsh in Florida, whose heartbroken father would go on to be a crime victim advocate and host of America's Most Wanted.
Good evening, I'm John Walsh.
In Oklahoma, there are cases involving teenaged and adult women where the two are suspected. If Lucas didn't confess to them, he said Toole did them between 1970 and 1982. Cindy Kinney would disappear June 23, 1976. Some witnesses say they saw her get into a car with two people who have never been identified, but the men never admitted to abducting Kinney. Both died in prison more than 20 years ago. In 1986, something came out called the Lucas Report. It was compiled by journalists, attorneys, and law enforcement, all looking at each of the confessions Lucas and Toole made together. In the end, it questioned if the two men were even in Oklahoma at all, and it says Lucas can only really be tied back to 3 of the killings he confessed to. Toole may have been a bit busier, but less than half a dozen of those can actually be tied to him.
As of now, the 1976 disappearance of Cynthia Kinney is still unsolved.
Fox 23 is going to keep following this case. We'll bring you any updates here on air and on fox23.com. We do have one more note. BTK has always been interested in news coverage of his cases.
That means it's possible the killer himself could be watching this very program right now from his prison cell.
Thanks to all of you for watching Fox 23 Investigates, BTK, and OK.